Little boy waves at Royal Guard for years. One day, the Royal Guard breaks protocol and stuns everyone. Every morning, as London stirred to life and the first rays of sunlight kissed the palace walls, William took his position. His polished boots gleamed against the cobblestones, his scarlet tunic perfectly pressed, and his bearskin cap sat precisely at regulation height. As a member of the Guard, he had mastered the art of becoming a living statue, his face an impenetrable mask of discipline and duty. It began on a crisp autumn morning. Among the usual crowd of tourists with their smartphones and selfie sticks, a small figure caught William's peripheral vision. A boy, no more than 6, with unruly brown hair and a missing front tooth, stood at the edge of the permitted area. Unlike the other children who would make faces or try to provoke a reaction, this boy simply raised his hand and waved, a genuine smile lighting up his face. William maintained his stoic expression, eyes fixed forward, as his training demanded. But something about the boy's sincerity struck a chord deep within him. No mockery, no attempt to make him break character, just a pure, simple greeting. The next day, the boy returned. Same time, same earnest wave. William found himself secretly anticipating the moment, though his exterior remained perfectly composed. The boy, he learned from conversations between passing locals, was named Leo. He lived in the neighborhood and passed by the palace on his way to school. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Through London's notorious rain, Leo would appear with a bright yellow raincoat, waving cheerfully while holding an umbrella that seemed too big for his small frame. During winter's bitter chill, he'd come bundled in a puffy coat, his red mittened hand still faithfully raising in greeting. Spring brought puddle jumping and occasional detours to examine bugs on the palace walls, but the wave never failed. As the seasons cycled, William observed Leo's subtle changes. The missing tooth was replaced by a permanent one. The boy grew taller, his school backpack changed designs from dinosaurs to superheroes to plain blue. His hair was sometimes neatly combed, sometimes wild from running, but his smile remained unchanged, genuine, warm, and completely devoid of the cynicism that often came with growing older. Other guards who rotated through the position would comment during breaks about the waving boy. He had become something of a legend among them. Some found it amusing, others mildly annoying, but William kept his thoughts to himself. He never revealed how he had memorized the sound of Leo's footsteps, how he could tell from the rhythm whether the boy was running late for school or taking his time on a leisurely morning. There were days when William's muscles ached from standing motionless for hours, when the weight of the bearskin cap felt particularly heavy, or when the weather was absolutely miserable. But Leo's daily greeting became an anchor, a reminder of the simple human connections that persisted even through the most rigid of protocols. Tourist groups would come and go, their cameras clicking and flashing. They would wave, make faces, even shout sometimes, trying to provoke a reaction. William remained immobile through it all, but he found himself increasingly grateful for the contrast Leo provided. The boy never tried to turn him into a tourist attraction or a social media moment. His wave wasn't for show, it was a genuine acknowledgement of the person behind the uniform. For years passed this way, marking more than 1,460 waves exchanged in silence. William never shifted his gaze directly to Leo, never altered his expression, never broke protocol in the slightest way. But in the privacy of his thoughts, he had come to see these brief morning moments as something sacred. They were a reminder that even in a world of carefully maintained barriers and protocols, authentic human connection could flourish in the smallest of gestures. What no one could see, hidden beneath William's carefully maintained exterior, was how he had begun to measure his days not by the changing of the guard or the striking of Big Ben, but by the arrival of a small boy with an unwavering smile and a faithful wave. It was their secret ritual, played out in plain sight of hundreds of tourists yet somehow remaining intimately personal. Little did William know that this simple routine, this daily exchange that had become as natural as breathing, was about to be disrupted in a way that would challenge everything he understood about duty, protocol, and the bonds that form in silence. The first day Leo didn't appear, William attributed it to a school holiday. The second day, he reasoned there might be a family vacation. By the third day, an unfamiliar sensation began to creep into his trained stoicism: worry. The spot where Leo usually stood remained conspicuously empty, like a missing brushstroke in an otherwise perfect painting. As a royal guard, William had been trained to notice patterns, to be hyper-aware of his surroundings while appearing completely detached. The absence of Leo's morning wave created a void that seemed to distort the very rhythm of his duty. The tourists still came with their cameras, the pigeons still strutted across the courtyard, but something fundamental had shifted in the palace's morning symphony. A week passed, and William found himself fighting an internal battle. His training demanded absolute focus, yet his mind kept drifting to worst-case scenarios. Had the family moved away without warning? Had something happened to Leo? The questions gnawed at him, threatening to crack his professional facade. During his breaks, William began paying closer attention to conversations among the palace staff. He'd linger near the security office, hoping to overhear any mention of the familiar face that had become such a constant part of his mornings. The other guards noticed the change in him, subtle as it was. William, who had always been the epitome of professional detachment, now seemed distracted, his eyes occasionally drifting to the empty spot where a young boy used to stand. 2 weeks into Leo's absence, William did something he'd never done before. During his off-duty hours, he changed into civilian clothes and walked the neighborhood surrounding the palace. He told himself it was just a normal evening stroll, but his eyes scanned every playground, every schoolyard, searching for a glimpse of unruly brown hair and that missing tooth smile. The local shops, which he'd passed countless times but never entered, suddenly became potential sources of information. He'd stop for coffee, casually mentioning the boy who used to wave at the palace guards. Some remembered Leo. Such a polite young man. But none knew where he'd gone. The uncertainty weighed heavier than his bearskin cap ever had. During one particularly long shift, William noticed an elderly palace housekeeper who often exchanged greetings with Leo's mother during her morning commute. Breaking years of self-imposed silence, he waited until the tourists were distracted and quietly asked if she'd heard anything about the boy. The housekeeper's surprised look at hearing the usually silent guard speak quickly turned to concern, but she had no information to share. The seasons were changing again, autumn leaves swirling where Leo used to stand. William maintained his post with military precision, but something had changed in his bearing. Other guards noticed that his typically perfect posture now carried a subtle tension, like a string pulled too tight. His eyes, though still fixed ahead as protocol demanded, held a shadow of something that hadn't been there before. Then, on a gray Wednesday morning that had started like any other, William saw her. Leo's mother, a woman he'd observed peripherally for years, walked slowly past the palace gates. The confident stride she once had was gone, replaced by the weighted steps of someone carrying an invisible burden. She looked older somehow, worn down by something William couldn't identify but instantly recognized as serious. She paused near his post, and for a moment, their eyes met. The connection was brief but loaded with unspoken meaning. William saw the recognition in her face. She knew he was the guard her son had waved to all these years. The dark circles under her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands told a story he didn't want to read. She took a step closer, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke the words that would shatter William's carefully maintained composure. "He's sick. He keeps asking if you ever wave back." The words hit William like a physical blow, though not a muscle in his face betrayed the impact. Inside, his mind raced through every morning, every wave, every smile he'd received but never returned. Protocol had been his shield, his excuse for maintaining distance, but now it felt like a prison. Leo's mother lingered for a moment longer, as if wanting to say more, but then turned and walked away, her shoulders slightly hunched against a weight that seemed to press down from above. William watched her go from the corner of his eye, his training warring with an impulse he'd never felt so strongly in all his years of service. That evening, after his shift ended, William sat alone in the guard's break room, still in full uniform, staring at his reflection in the window. The prestigious uniform that had always been a source of pride now felt constricting. The rules and protocols that had governed his life for so long suddenly seemed inadequate in the face of a simple truth: Somewhere in a hospital bed lay a boy who had shown him kindness every day for years, wondering if any of it had mattered. As night fell over London, William made a decision that would either end his career or redefine what it meant to serve with honor. He knew the consequences of breaking protocol, knew the weight of centuries of tradition that demanded he maintain his distance and dignity. But he also knew that some duties transcend those written in military manuals. Tomorrow would bring a choice, between the oath he'd sworn to the crown and a silent promise he'd made to himself, watching a young boy wave day after day. As William finally left the palace grounds that night, his footsteps echoing through the empty courtyard, he realized that for the first time in his career, he was prepared to risk everything for something that wouldn't be found in any guardsman's rulebook. In the pre-dawn hours, William stood before his wardrobe, his hand hovering over his ceremonial uniform. For the first time in his career, he reached past it, selecting instead a modest civilian suit. Each button he fastened felt like a small act of rebellion against years of ingrained discipline. The weight of his decision pressed upon him more heavily than any bearskin cap ever had. St. Thomas Hospital loomed before him, its modern glass facade a stark contrast to the ancient stones of the palace he'd guarded for so long. William's military training had taught him to face danger without flinching, but his hands trembled slightly as he approached the reception desk. "I'm here to see Leo Matthews," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority he maintained at his post. The nurse eyed him suspiciously, checking her records. "Are you family?" "No," William replied, his throat tight. I'm the guard he waves to." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Oh, you're him. The boy's been talking about you." She led him through sterile corridors, past rooms filled with beeping machines and hushed voices. The hospital smells, antiseptic and illness, reminded William of his own childhood visits to his grandfather. He pushed the memory aside, focusing on maintaining his composure. Room 403 appeared before him, its door slightly ajar. William heard the soft whir of medical equipment before he saw anything else. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside, his military bearing automatically straightening his spine. Leo lay in a bed that seemed too large for his diminished frame. 4 lines snaked from his arms, and monitors cast a pale blue glow across his face. But when his eyes opened and fell upon William, the change was instantaneous. The weak, sick child transformed into the boy who had waved so faithfully every morning, his face lighting up with pure joy. "You came," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with wonder. "You really came." William moved to the bedside, his trained stillness deserting him as he sank into the chair beside the bed. Up close, he could see how illness had hollowed Leo's cheeks and darkened the circles under his eyes. Yet that irrepressible spirit still shone through, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "I never thought." Leo started, then paused to catch his breath. "I never thought you'd actually come. Mom said you couldn't leave your post." "Some posts," William replied, his voice soft but steady, "are more important than others." The words felt foreign in his mouth. He'd spoken more in these few minutes than he had in years of guard duty. A weak smile played across Leo's lips. "Did you ever see me? All those times I waved?" William leaned forward, his professional mask cracking. "Every single day," he admitted. "Your wave was the most reliable part of my watch. More consistent than Big Ben." Leo's laugh turned into a cough, and William instinctively reached for the water glass on the bedside table. As he helped Leo take a sip, he noticed the drawings taped to the wall, crude crayon sketches of a guard in a red uniform and tall black hat. In each one, the guard was smiling. "I made those," Leo said, following William's gaze. "The nurses said it would help to draw what makes me happy." He paused, his next words coming out in a rush. "Some kids at school said you were just a robot, that you couldn't move or smile or anything. But I knew better. I could tell you were real." William felt something crack inside his chest, not his resolve or his discipline, but rather the wall he'd built between his duty and his humanity. "I made a promise," he said, the words emerging before he could stop them. Leo's eyes widened with curiosity, but before he could ask, A noise at the door made them both turn. A nurse stood there, clipboard in hand, surprise evident on her face at seeing the visitor. "Time for your medication, Leo," she announced, though her eyes remained fixed on William. As she administered the medicine, William rose to leave, knowing he'd already stayed longer than he should. But Leo's hand shot out, surprisingly strong for someone so ill, and grabbed his sleeve. "Will you come back?" The question held all the hope and fear that Leo had never shown in his years of waving. William looked down at the small hand clutching his jacket, then at the face that had greeted him every morning for years. In that moment, he wasn't a royal guard bound by centuries of tradition. He was simply a man making a promise to a child who had shown him nothing but kindness. "Try to stop me," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. As he turned to leave, Leo called out one last time. "Next time, will you wear your uniform? I always wanted to see it up close." William paused at the door, looking back at the boy who had breached every defense he'd ever built. "Next time," he promised, "I'll wear it properly. With honors." Walking out of the hospital into the grey London morning, William knew he'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His next shift would start in 3 hours, and for the first time in his career, he was about to report for duty with his heart firmly overruling his training. But as he thought of Leo's face lighting up at his arrival, of the drawings on the hospital wall, and of 4 years of faithful waves, William realized that some protocols were meant to be broken. Some traditions, no matter how ancient or revered, had to bend in the face of something more powerful, the simple, unwavering faith of a child who had never stopped believing in the humanity behind the uniform. "What promise?" The words hung in the still hospital air as Leo's mother stepped into the room. She'd arrived moments after William's declaration, her face a mixture of confusion and dawning recognition. You knew my husband?" William stood at attention, a habit so ingrained it manifested even in his civilian clothes. The time for maintaining silence had passed. He owed them both the truth that he'd carried for so long. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I served with James for 3 years before." His voice trailed off, the memory of that fateful day still sharp despite the passing years. "We were more than colleagues. We were friends." Leo's eyes darted between his mother and William, his small face scrunched in concentration as he tried to process this revelation. "You knew my dad?" The question came out barely above a whisper. William moved to the window, gazing out at the London skyline as the weight of his long-held secret pressed against his chest. "It was during the changing of the guard, 5 years ago. A routine day, just like any other." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "James was always the best of us, professional, dedicated, but he never lost his humanity. That was rare in our line of work." Sarah sank into a chair, her hands trembling slightly. "The accident, you were there?" William nodded, the scene playing out in his mind with crystal clarity. "There was a security breach, someone had scaled the palace fence. James was the first to respond. He always was." A sad smile crossed his face. "He managed to apprehend the intruder, but in the struggle." William's voice caught. The wall they were near had been under renovation. The scaffolding wasn't secure. Leo lay silent in his bed, absorbing every word about the father he'd barely known. His usual energy was replaced by an intense focus that made him seem older than his years. "Before the ambulance arrived," William continued, his voice growing hoarse, "James made me promise something. He knew somehow that he wouldn't." He stopped, composing himself. He grabbed my arm and said, "Watch over them, Will. My boy, he'll need someone to show him what it means to stand tall." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as the pieces fell into place. "All these years, Leo waving at you. I couldn't break protocol," William explained, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "But I could keep my post near your walking route. I could make sure I was there every morning when Leo passed by. I could watch him grow, just as James asked me to. But why didn't you tell us?" Sarah's voice held no accusation, only a deep sadness for all the years of silent connection that could have been something more. William turned back to face them, his military bearing softening. At first, I thought it was better this way, keeping my distance while fulfilling my promise. Then, when Leo started waving, he looked at the boy, managing a small smile. It became our own kind of connection. I told myself it was enough. The other guards? Leo spoke up suddenly. They sometimes changed positions. But you were always there. I requested permanent assignment to that post, William admitted. Called in every favor I had. Some of the other guards thought I was mad, wanting to stand in the same spot day after day. But it was the only way I could keep my promise to James. Sarah stood, crossing the room to stand before William. James would talk about you, you know. Good old Will, he'd say, the most devoted guard in the service. But he also said you were the most human. The irony of those words wasn't lost on William. I failed in that part, he said quietly. I was so focused on keeping my oath as a guard that I forgot the most important part of James's request, to be there for you both, truly there. You weren't a guard to me, Leo piped up from his bed. You were my friend. Even though you never waved back, I knew you were watching. I could feel it. William moved to Leo's bedside, his composure cracking further. Your father was the finest man I ever knew, Leo. He loved you more than anything. The day you were born, he couldn't stop smiling during his entire shift. Nearly got himself disciplined for breaking character. Leo managed a weak laugh, though his eyes were bright with tears. Did he wave at the guards too? No, William replied, a genuine smile breaking through. He did something much worse. He would tell jokes during the changing of the guard, trying to make us laugh. Nearly succeeded a few times too. Sarah reached out, taking William's hand. James would be proud, you know, of how you've watched over us. Even if it wasn't in the way he might have expected. William looked down at their clasped hands, then at Leo, seeing James's features reflected in his son's face. I should have done more, he said firmly. I should have been there properly, not just as a silent observer. James wouldn't have wanted me to hide behind protocol. You're here now, Leo said simply, his voice carrying a wisdom beyond his years. That's what matters. As the truth settled around them, William felt the weight of his secret lifting, replaced by a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just a guard keeping a promise to a fallen comrade. He was a connection to a father Leo had barely known, a living link to the man who had given his life in service to the crown. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital room as the three of them sat together, sharing stories of James, the soldier, the husband, the father. For the first time in years, William felt truly aligned with his promise to his friend. Not just watching from afar, but actively participating in the lives James had left behind. As Sarah began telling Leo about his father's first day as a royal guard, William realized that sometimes the greatest acts of loyalty aren't found in unwavering adherence to protocol, but in knowing when to set it aside for something more important, the human connections that give life its deepest meaning. The hospital room fell silent as William entered, this time in his full ceremonial uniform. Every button polished to a mirror shine, every crease razor sharp, his bearskin cap tucked precisely under his arm. The same uniform he wore every day at his post, but today it meant something different. Today, it wasn't just a symbol of duty to the crown, it was a tribute to a boy who had never lost faith in the person behind the uniform. Leo's condition had deteriorated rapidly over the past few days. The machines around his bed beeped with increasing urgency, and the doctor's whispered conversations in the hallway grew more serious. But when he saw William, Leo's face lit up with the same brightness that had accompanied every morning wave for the past 4 years. The hospital staff paused in their duties, watching from the doorway. This wasn't standard protocol, a royal guard in full ceremonial dress visiting a patient. Some pulled out their phones, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. William approached Leo's bed with measured steps, each footfall echoing with military precision on the linoleum floor. Sarah stood at her son's bedside, her hands clasped tightly together, tears already forming in her eyes. She knew what this visit meant, they all did. "Leo Matthews," William spoke, his voice carrying the same authority it held at the palace, but softened with an underlying warmth. "For 4 years, you have shown unwavering dedication in your daily salutations to the Crown's guards. Such loyalty deserves recognition." Leo tried to sit up straighter, though the effort clearly cost him. His skin was pale as the hospital sheets, but his eyes shone with an inner light that no illness could dim. "I never missed a day," he whispered proudly. Until now." William completed the thought, his voice gentle. "And yet your spirit has remained as faithful as ever." Then, in a move that would have shocked his fellow guards to their core, William removed his bearskin cap and placed it carefully on a nearby chair. The action itself was enough to make several nurses gasp. Royal guards never removed their caps while in uniform, except in the presence of royalty. But William wasn't finished. With deliberate movements, he straightened to his full height, squared his shoulders, and did something that broke centuries of tradition. He knelt beside Leo's bed, coming eye to eye with the boy who had breached every defense he built around his heart. "Leo Matthews," he announced formally, though his voice quavered slightly. "On behalf of the Guard, and in recognition of your extraordinary service to the spirit of our traditions." William raised his right hand to his forehead in a formal Royal Guard salute. Not the quick gesture civilians often received, but the full, ceremonial salute reserved for the highest-ranking officials. His form was perfect, every angle precise, every movement calculated, just as he'd been trained. The room held its collective breath. Even the machine seemed to beat more quietly. Leo's mother pressed her hands to her mouth, tears flowing freely now. The hospital staff in the doorway stood transfixed, witnessing a moment when centuries of rigid protocol bent in the face of something more powerful, pure, unconditional love. Leo's face transformed with wonder. Slowly, with tremendous effort, he raised his own small hand to return the salute. His arm trembled with weakness, but his eyes never left William's face. "Finally," he whispered, a smile breaking across his features. "You saw me." "I always saw you, Leo," William replied, maintaining his salute. "Every single day. Every wave. Every smile. You reminded me what it means to serve with honor, not just the crown, but humanity itself." The moment stretched, crystallizing into something sacred. Here was a royal guard, breaking every rule in the book, kneeling before a sick child. Yet somehow, it felt like the most honorable thing William had ever done in his years of service. The nurses and doctors who had gathered to watch began to quietly applaud, the sound building until it filled the small room. Sarah joined William at her son's bedside, placing one hand on his shoulder in silent gratitude. As the applause faded, Leo's eyes began to droop, the effort of the moment taking its toll. But his smile remained brighter than ever. "Will you stay?" he asked softly. "Just for a while?" William glanced at Sarah, who nodded through her tears. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, settling into the chair beside the bed but maintaining his perfect posture. A royal guard never abandons his post. Throughout the long night that followed, William kept his vigil. He shared stories about Leo's father, about the proud traditions of the guard, about the countless small moments he'd observed during Leo's daily visits. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, but each time he opened his eyes, William was there, steady as ever. The hospital staff moved quietly around them, checking vitals and adjusting medications. Many paused to witness the unusual scene, a royal guard in full ceremonial dress, keeping watch over a small boy who had taught him the true meaning of loyalty. As dawn approached, casting its first pale light through the hospital window, William realized something profound. In all his years of service, standing guard at the palace, he had never felt more aligned with the true spirit of his duty than he did in this moment. Here, maintaining his post at the bedside of a boy who had shown him that the greatest acts of service often had nothing to do with protocol at all. The early morning light caught the brass buttons of William's uniform, making them gleam like stars. Leo, briefly awake, noticed the effect. "It's like your uniform is made of gold," he whispered. "The finest gold," William agreed softly, "is the heart that sees the person behind the uniform." He reached out and took Leo's small hand in his own, protocol forgotten in the face of a higher calling, the simple act of being there for someone who needed him. Outside, London was waking up, but inside room 403, time seemed to stand still. A royal guard and a young boy, connected by something stronger than tradition, stronger than protocol, stronger even than the illness that threatened to separate them, the pure, unbreakable bond of two souls who had found each other across an impossible divide. The news reached the palace guard quarters on a quiet Tuesday morning. Leo had passed peacefully in his sleep, his mother by his side, still holding the small medallion William had given him, a replica of the royal guard's insignia. The usually stoic guardroom fell into a heavy silence, even those who had never met Leo feeling the weight of the loss. William stood at his post that morning, his face a mask of professional detachment, but his heart heavier than the bearskin cap he wore. The spot where Leo used to stand seemed to mock him with its emptiness. Yet, for the first time in his career, he allowed a single tear to fall behind his ceremonial facade, a tribute to the boy who had taught the guards more about honor than any military training ever could. When William requested permission to attend Leo's funeral, his commanding officer initially hesitated. It was unprecedented, a royal guard attending a civilian funeral in full ceremonial dress. But as the story of Leo and his daily waves had spread through the ranks, reaching even the highest levels of palace administration, something remarkable happened. Not only was William's request granted, but an official proclamation was issued: the guard would render full honors at the service. The day of the funeral dawned bright and clear, a rarity for London. The small church was filled beyond capacity, with people spilling out onto the street. Among the mourners were faces William recognized from his years at his post: local shopkeepers, school children, palace staff who had watched Leo's daily ritual. But what drew everyone's attention was the line of royal guards in full ceremonial dress, standing at attention outside the church. William led them, his uniform immaculate, his bearing perfect. As Leo's small coffin passed by, carried by pallbearers including his young schoolmates, the guards moved in perfect synchronization, raising their rifles in the highest form of military tribute. Sarah, walking behind the coffin, paused beside William. In her hands she clutched a folder containing hundreds of drawings Leo had made of his favorite guard. "He drew one every day he couldn't come to see you," she whispered. "Even in the hospital, he never stopped believing in the magic of your connection." At the graveside, William stepped forward. Breaking with centuries of tradition one final time, he removed his bearskin cap and knelt beside the small grave. With deliberate movements, he placed his guard's medallion on the coffin, a gesture traditionally reserved for fallen comrades. "Rest easy, young soldier," he said, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. "Your watch is over." Rising to his feet, William executed one last perfect salute, a farewell to both Leo and the promise he had made to James years ago. But as he lowered his hand, something unexpected happened. From the crowd, a small child stepped forward and waved at him, mimicking Leo's daily greeting. William, moved by the gesture, did something that would change the guard forever. He acknowledged the wave with a slight, dignified nod. The ripple effect was immediate. In the weeks that followed, as word of Leo's story spread through London and beyond, something changed at the palace. Children who had once tried to provoke reactions from the guards now approached with respectful waves. And while the guards maintained their legendary discipline, a new tradition began to emerge. Each morning, as children passed by on their way to school, the guards would acknowledge their waves with the smallest of nods, nearly imperceptible to most observers, but clear as day to the children who offered their greetings. It became known as Leo's salute, a tiny breach of protocol that somehow made the guards seem more, not less, honorable. The palace officially recognized this new tradition in a small but significant way. A discreet plaque was installed near William's old post, reading, "In memory of Leo Matthews, who taught us that the greatest strength lies not in remaining unmoved, but in knowing when to bend." William continued his service, but his role evolved. He became responsible for training new guards, teaching them not just about protocol and discipline, but about the human element of their duty. He would tell them Leo's story, explaining how a small boy's unwavering faith had transformed centuries of tradition. On quiet mornings, when the tourists haven't yet arrived and the sun is just rising over London, William sometimes stands at his old post. In these moments, he can almost see Leo there, waving with that bright, genuine smile. But now, instead of maintaining his stoic facade, William allows himself the smallest of nods, a gesture that would have meant the world to a young boy who never lost faith in the person behind the uniform. The legacy of Leo's simple act, waving at a guard every day, had created ripples that transformed one of the world's most rigid military traditions. It proved that sometimes the greatest changes come not from grand gestures or official decrees, but from the pure, persistent kindness of a child who refused to believe that any barrier was too great for human connection to bridge. And so, while tourists still flock to photograph the famously stoic guard, those who know where to look can see something more: the subtle nods, the tiny acknowledgments that remind us all that behind every uniform, behind every tradition, beats a human heart capable of being touched by the simplest acts of kindness. In the end, Leo's story became more than just the tale of a boy who waved at a guard. It became a testament to the power of human connection, a reminder that even the most unbreakable protocols can, and sometimes should, bend in the face of pure, unconditional love. His legacy lives on in every wave, every nod, every moment when tradition yields to humanity, proving that sometimes the greatest honor lies not in standing unmoved, but in knowing when to wave back.